The fluorescent lights in Dr. Peterson's office buzzed overhead as my family sat in that uncomfortable circle of chairs. Mom fidgeted with her wedding ring, Dad checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, and I stared at the motivational poster on the wall that read, "Growth begins at the end of your comfort zone." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. This wasn't our first rodeo with family therapy. We'd been coming here for 6 months, ever since what Dad called my breakdown, and what I preferred to think of as my complete system failure. It started small: panic attacks at work, sleepless nights, the overwhelming feeling that I was drowning in my own life. But when I had to take medical leave from my job as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, Dad decided intervention was necessary. "Sarah tends to dramatize situations," Dad was saying to Dr. Peterson, as if I wasn't sitting right there. "She's always been overly sensitive, cries at commercials, gets upset when someone raises their voice. It's not like Marcus. My son's got a real backbone. He's deployed overseas right now with the Special Forces, handling actual problems." Dr. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Williams, how do you think it makes Sarah feel when you compare her to her brother?" "I'm not comparing," Dad said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just stating facts. Marcus has been through Ranger School, airborne training, Special Forces selection. He's seen combat. That builds character. Sarah's biggest challenge is dealing with difficult patients at the hospital." I wanted to speak up, to tell him about Mrs. Rodriguez, who coded 3 times in one shift, or about holding the hand of a 19-year-old car accident victim as he died because his family couldn't get there in time. I wanted to explain that strength isn't always about jumping out of airplanes or carrying a rifle through hostile territory. But I'd learned that defending myself only gave Dad more ammunition about my defensiveness. "Sarah," Dr. Peterson turned to me, "how do you respond to your father's concerns?" I took a deep breath. I think Dad has a very narrow definition of strength. Just because I process emotions differently than Marcus doesn't make me weak. "See?" Dad threw his hands up. "There she goes again with the psychology talk. Marcus doesn't need to, quote, process emotions. He just gets the job done." Mom finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert, maybe we should listen to what Sarah has to say." "Listen to what, Linda? More excuses about why she can't handle normal adult responsibilities? She's 28 years old and still falling apart every time life gets a little difficult?" That's when something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic way, more like a guitar string that's been stretched too tight finally giving way. "You want to know about handling difficult situations, Dad? Last month, I worked a 12-hour shift in the ICU. We had a mass casualty event from a highway pileup. 7 people came in, 3 of them kids. I helped save 4 lives that night while covered in blood and running on 2 hours of sleep. But sure, let's talk about how I can't handle normal adult responsibilities." Dad's expression didn't change. "That's your job, Sarah. You're supposed to handle medical emergencies. That's what they pay you for. And Marcus gets paid to be a soldier. So by your logic, neither of us is particularly special. Don't you dare compare what you do to what your brother does. He's putting his life on the line for this country. And I'm putting my life on the line for individual human beings every single day. Different battlefield, same stakes." Dr. Peterson intervened before Dad could respond. "I think we're seeing some important dynamics here. Robert, you seem to value certain types of strength over others. Sarah, you're feeling unheard and undervalued. Let's explore this further." But Dad was already shaking his head. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Everything has to be analyzed and discussed, and feelings have to be validated. Marcus doesn't need his feelings validated. He just does what needs to be done." "You don't know what Marcus needs," I said quietly. "You haven't had a real conversation with him in 2 years." That hit a nerve. Dad's jaw tightened. "I know my son. We email regularly. He tells me about his missions, his training, his accomplishments. Real things. Not feelings in therapy sessions. When's the last time you asked him how he's actually doing? Not about work, not about accomplishments, how he's doing as a person. He's fine. If he wasn't fine, he'd tell me." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Dad had created this perfect image of Marcus as the emotionally bulletproof warrior son. while casting me as the fragile daughter who couldn't handle real life. The truth was more complicated, but Dad had never been interested in complications. Marcus and I had always been close, despite the 4-year age difference. Growing up, he was my protector, the one who stood up to bullies, who taught me how to throw a punch, who stayed up late helping me with math homework. When he enlisted at 18, I was devastated. But we stayed in touch through emails and video calls, and I saw sides of him that Dad never did. I saw him struggle with the weight of leadership when he became responsible for other soldiers' lives. I saw him question himself after difficult missions. I saw him work through trauma and doubt and fear, not by suppressing those emotions, but by acknowledging them and finding healthy ways to cope. Marcus was strong, absolutely, but his strength included emotional intelligence and vulnerability, things Dad would never recognize as strengths. The point is, Dad continued, Sarah needs to toughen up. The world isn't going to coddle her the way this family has. She needs to learn to deal with problems instead of falling apart every time something goes wrong. I don't fall apart, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. I seek help when I need it. I acknowledge when I'm struggling. I work through problems instead of pretending they don't exist. That's falling apart with extra steps. Dr. Peterson leaned forward. Robert, I'm curious about your own relationship with difficult emotions. How do you typically handle stress or sadness? I handle it. I don't make it everyone else's problem. And what does handling it look like for you? Dad shifted uncomfortably. I focus on solutions. I don't dwell on problems. But sometimes processing emotions is part of finding solutions, I interjected. You can't solve problems you won't acknowledge exist. Life isn't a therapy session, Sarah. Sometimes you just have to push through. And sometimes pushing through without dealing with underlying issues just creates bigger problems down the road. We were at an impasse, the same one we'd been at for months. Dad saw emotional awareness as weakness, while I saw emotional suppression as a ticking time bomb. Neither of us was going to convince the other, and Dr. Peterson seemed to recognize this. I think we've identified some core differences in how you each view strength and coping mechanisms, she said diplomatically. Perhaps we can explore where these different perspectives come from. But I was done exploring. I was tired of being told I was weak for having feelings. Tired of being compared to a brother whose struggles Dad refused to see. Tired of defending my right to exist as a complex human being, rather than Dad's narrow definition of acceptable strength. What I didn't know was that in 3 weeks everything would change. Marcus would call me from a secure line halfway around the world, and the conversation we'd have would shatter every assumption Dad had made about both of us. But for now, I sat in that buzzing, fluorescent-lit room, labeled as the weak one, wondering if I'd ever be strong enough in my father's eyes. The session ended with the usual homework assignments and scheduling of the next appointment. As we walked to the parking lot, Dad was already moving on to practical matters. Dinner plans, weekend projects, anything but the emotional minefield we'd just navigated. Mom squeezed my shoulder sympathetically but didn't say anything. She'd learned long ago that getting between Dad and his opinions was a losing battle. I drove home alone, Dad's words echoing in my mind. You've always been the weak one in this family. The thing about being told you're weak often enough is that you start to believe it, even when every rational part of your brain knows it isn't true. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital when my phone rang with an international number I didn't recognize. In my family, unexpected calls from overseas meant one of two things. Either Marcus was checking in during a brief communication window, or something had gone terribly wrong. Sarah? Thank God you answered. Marcus's voice sounded different, strained, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. Background noise suggested he was calling from some kind of operations center, voices and radio chatter echoing in the distance. Marcus, what's wrong? Are you okay? I'm fine, physically anyway, but I need to tell you something and I don't have much time on this line. He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. We had an incident 3 days ago, bad one. I almost lost my entire squad. My stomach dropped. Marcus had been deployed for 8 months, and while he'd mentioned difficult missions before, he'd never sounded like this. There was something raw in his voice, something broken. What happened? We were conducting a night raid on a suspected weapons cache about 40 clicks north of our forward operating base. Intelligence was solid, or so we thought. 12 of us went in, standard extraction team. But the intel was wrong, Sarah. It wasn't a weapons cache. It was a trap. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I sank onto my couch, suddenly unable to stand. A trap? They were waiting for us. Had the whole compound rigged with IEDs, sniper positions would be set up on the surrounding hills. The moment we breached the perimeter, all hell broke loose. Johnson got hit first. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive took out his left leg. Then Rodriguez went down with a bullet through the shoulder. We were pinned down in this courtyard with nowhere to go and no backup for at least 20 minutes. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, and I realized I was hearing something I'd never heard before. My invincible big brother falling apart. That's when everything I learned from you kicked in. From me? I was confused. Marcus, I've never been in combat. I don't know anything about military tactics. Not military tactics, Sarah. Everything else. All those conversations we had when I was struggling with leadership training. All those times you talked me through panic attacks during my first deployment. All those techniques you taught me for staying calm under pressure. I remembered those conversations. Late-night video calls where Marcus would be visibly shaking, overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping other soldiers alive. I'd taught him breathing exercises I'd learned in nursing school, grounding techniques for managing acute stress, ways to compartmentalize trauma without suppressing it entirely. At the time, I thought I was just being a supportive sister. I had no idea those conversations would save lives. I started using the box breathing technique you showed me, Marcus continued. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, hold for 4. It cleared my head enough to assess the situation properly. Then, I remembered what you said about breaking overwhelming problems into manageable pieces. The nursing triage method, I whispered, remembering the conversation he was referencing. Exactly. Instead of seeing it as we're all going to die, I broke it down. Johnson needs immediate medical attention. Rodriguez needs covering fire. We need an escape route. We need to call for backup. Manageable pieces. I was crying now, though I wasn't sure why. Pride, relief, disbelief, all of it mixing together into something I couldn't name. But that wasn't the hard part, Sarah. The hard part was what happened after. Marcus went quiet for so long I thought we'd lost the connection. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. We made it out, all of us. Johnson's gonna walk again. Rodriguez is already back on duty. But when we got back to base, I completely lost it. I'm talking full breakdown. Shaking, hyperventilating, couldn't stop replaying every second of that firefight. My commanding officer was ready to pull me from active duty. This was the Marcus that Dad never saw, never wanted to see, the human being behind the soldier, the man who felt the weight of nearly losing 11 people under his command. What did you do? I did what you always told me to do. I asked for help. I went to the base counselor and told him exactly what was happening. I used every coping mechanism you'd taught me over the years. And Sarah, it worked. Not immediately, but it worked. He paused again, and I heard someone calling his name in the background. I've got to go in a minute, but I need you to know something. After the counseling session, I was talking to Sergeant Martinez. He's been in the military for 15 years, seen more combat than most people could imagine. And he said something that's been stuck in my head for 3 days. What did he say? He said, Williams, whoever taught you those techniques saved your squad. Most soldiers would have frozen up or made rash decisions under that kind of pressure. But you stayed calm, made smart choices, and kept everyone alive. And then you had the balls to deal with the aftermath instead of pretending it didn't affect you. That's real strength. My breath caught in my throat. Sarah, you saved my entire squad. Not directly, but every conversation we had, every technique you taught me, every time you helped me work through something I couldn't handle alone, it all came together that night. You saved 11 lives. I was sobbing now, the phone shaking in my hand. Marcus, I didn't do anything special. You just what? Just listened when I needed someone to listen? Just taught me that acknowledging weakness isn't the same as being weak, just showed me that asking for help is actually the strongest thing you can do? The line crackled with static, and I heard more voices in the background. I have to go, but Sarah, I need you to remember this conversation. I need you to remember it the next time Dad tells you you're weak. Because the weakness he sees in you, your emotional intelligence, your ability to process trauma, your willingness to seek help when you need it, that weakness kept my friends alive. Marcus, I love you, little sister, and I'm proud of you. Not just for this, but for who you are. For staying soft in a world that tries to make everyone hard. For caring about people's feelings when everyone else tells you feelings don't matter. For being strong enough to be vulnerable. The line went dead. I sat on my couch for 20 minutes staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My brother, Dad's golden child, the picture of masculine strength and military discipline, had just told me that my so-called weaknesses had saved lives. That the emotional skills Dad dismissed as character flaws had kept 11 soldiers from coming home in body bags. The irony was staggering. All those years of being told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too weak to handle real problems, and it turned out those exact qualities had prepared me to help my brother handle the most real problem imaginable. I called in sick to work that day, not because I was having a breakdown, but because I needed time to think. For the first time in my life, I saw myself through someone else's eyes, not as the fragile daughter who couldn't handle stress, but as the person who'd equipped a Green Beret with the tools he needed to save lives. The next therapy session was still 2 weeks away, but I was already planning what I would say to Dad. Not to convince him that I was strong. I was done seeking his validation. But to tell him the truth about his son, about real strength, about the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is admit you don't have all the answers. Marcus's call had changed everything, but not in the way I expected. I didn't suddenly feel vindicated or victorious. Instead, I felt something much more valuable. I felt seen. For the first time in my life, someone had looked at my supposed weaknesses and recognized them as strengths. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 2 weeks felt like both an eternity and no time at all. I went through the motions at work, checking IVs, administering medications, comforting families. But Marcus's words echoed in every interaction. When I calmed down Mrs. Patterson during her anxiety attack before surgery, I heard him saying, "You stayed soft in a world that tries to make everyone hard." When I helped train a new nurse through her first trauma case, I remembered, acknowledging weakness isn't the same as being weak. I didn't tell anyone about the call. Not my coworkers, not my friends, not even Mom. This felt like something that needed to happen in that therapy room, with all of us present. Dad had spent years building his narrative about Marcus and me, and it was time for that narrative to crumble. The day of our appointment, I arrived early and sat in Dr. Peterson's waiting room, watching other families shuffle in and out. A teenage boy argued with his mother about curfew. An elderly couple held hands while discussing their son's addiction. Everyone carrying their own version of complicated love and disappointment. When my parents arrived, Dad looked particularly pleased with himself. He'd gotten an email from Marcus the night before. Just a standard check-in about base life and training exercises. Dad had forwarded it to me with the subject line, "See? Marcus is thriving. No therapy needed." If only he knew. Dr. Peterson welcomed us back into her office, and we took our usual positions in the circle. She started with her typical opening question about how everyone was feeling since our last session. "Actually," I said before Dad could launch into his weekly critique of my emotional stability, "I have something I need to share with both of you. I heard from Marcus a few days ago." Dad perked up immediately. "Oh, good. I got his email too. Did he tell you about the new training program he's leading? I'm very proud of." "He called me about a mission that went wrong." The room went silent. Dad's expression shifted from pride to concern to something that looked almost like irritation. "What do you mean, went wrong? Marcus doesn't fail missions." I took a deep breath, drawing on every technique I'd ever learned for staying calm under pressure. "Dad, Marcus and his entire squad were nearly killed 3 days ago. They walked into a trap, took heavy casualties, and barely made it out alive. That's impossible. Marcus would have told me if something like that happened." Would he? When's the last time Marcus told you about anything difficult? When's the last time he shared a struggle or asked for advice or admitted he was scared? Dad's jaw tightened. If something serious had happened, the military would have contacted us. They have protocols for these things. Nobody died, Dad. They all survived. But barely. And do you know why they survived? Dr. Peterson leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of whatever I was about to reveal. They survived because Marcus used techniques I taught him. Breathing exercises for staying calm under pressure. Mental frameworks for breaking overwhelming problems into manageable pieces. Emotional regulation skills for making clear decisions when everything is falling apart. Dad stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. That's ridiculous. Marcus is trained for combat situations. He doesn't need. He broke down completely after the mission, Dad. Hyperventilating, shaking, couldn't stop replaying the firefight. His commanding officer almost pulled him from active duty. You're making this up. The accusation hit like a slap, but I'd expected it. Dad couldn't process information that contradicted his worldview, so he simply rejected it as false. I'm not making it up. Marcus spent an hour on the phone with me, crying, telling me how the coping mechanisms I'd taught him over the years saved 11 lives. His sergeant said that whoever trained him in those techniques was responsible for keeping the entire squad alive. Mom spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. Sarah, is Marcus okay now? He's getting help, real help, from a counselor on base. And he's doing better because he was willing to admit he needed support. Dad shook his head vigorously. This doesn't make sense. Marcus is mentally tough. He's been through the most rigorous training in the world. He doesn't have panic attacks. Everyone has panic attacks under enough stress, Dad. The difference is whether you know how to handle them or whether you pretend they're not happening and make dangerous decisions as a result. I don't believe this. Marcus would have called me directly if something this serious had happened. The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. I pulled out my phone and opened my call log, showing the international number and the duration of our conversation. Then I opened my photos and showed them a screenshot Marcus had sent me, a picture of him with his squad, taken just hours before the mission that nearly killed them all. He didn't call you, Dad, because he knew you'd react exactly like you're reacting right now. You'd either dismiss his trauma as weakness or blame him for not being tough enough to handle it. That's not true, isn't it? You've spent my entire life telling me that emotional awareness is a character flaw, that seeking help is giving up, that acknowledging pain is the same as being defeated by it. Why would Marcus risk sharing his most vulnerable moment with someone who's never made it safe to be vulnerable? Dr. Peterson intervened gently. Robert, how are you feeling about what Sarah is sharing? I'm feeling like my daughter is trying to rewrite history to make herself feel better about her own issues. The words stung, but they also clarified something important. Dad wasn't just dismissing Marcus's trauma. He was dismissing the idea that his parenting might have contributed to Marcus feeling unable to share that trauma with him. Dad, Marcus specifically asked me to tell you something. What? I looked him directly in the eyes. He said that the next time you call me weak, I should remember that my weakness kept his friends from coming home in body bags. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, anger, denial, and something that might have been hurt. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said finally. You're taking a normal military situation and turning it into some kind of validation for your therapy obsession. A normal military situation? Dad, 11 people almost died. That's what happens in war zones, Sarah. People get shot at. That's the job. It doesn't mean Marcus needed his sister's breathing exercises to do his job properly. I realized at that moment that I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd thought that presenting Dad with evidence of Marcus's humanity would help him recognize my own strength. But Dad's investment in seeing Marcus as invulnerable wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about Dad's own relationship with vulnerability. Why is it so important to you that Marcus never struggles? I asked. Because struggle is weakness, and weakness gets people killed. No, Dad. Denying struggle is what gets people killed. Pretending you're not affected by trauma is what leads to poor judgment and dangerous decisions. Marcus stayed alive because he was willing to acknowledge what he was feeling and use healthy coping mechanisms to work through it. That's psychology nonsense. That's reality. And the reality is that your son, your perfect, invincible, emotionally bulletproof son, has been struggling for years. He's been having panic attacks since his second deployment. He's been questioning his leadership abilities. He's been working through guilt and fear and trauma, just like any other human being would. Dad stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. Yes, you do, Mom said quietly. It was the first time I'd ever heard her directly contradict him. You do have to listen to this because it's about our children. Dad turned to look at her, surprise replacing anger on his face. Robert, I've watched you dismiss Sarah's feelings for years. And I've watched Marcus pretend everything is fine. Because he knows you can't handle the truth about what his job really costs him. Our daughter is trying to tell us that she helped save lives, and you're more concerned with protecting your idea of who Marcus should be than celebrating who he actually is. The room fell silent again. Dr. Peterson watched carefully as decades of family dynamics shifted in real time. Dad sat back down slowly. Marcus never told me he was struggling. Because you never made it safe for him to struggle, I said softly, just like you've never made it safe for me. For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. Not angry, not dismissive, but genuinely unsure of himself. I don't know how to. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to say that emotional intelligence is a strength, not a weakness. I want you to say that seeking help is courage, not failure. I want you to acknowledge that Marcus and I are both strong, just in different ways. Dad looked at his hands for a long moment. When he looked back up, something in his expression had changed. I still think you're too sensitive, he said finally. It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't total defeat either. There was something different in his tone. Less certainty, more questioning. Maybe, I replied, but maybe that sensitivity is exactly what Marcus needed when his world was falling apart. And for the first time in 30 years, my father didn't have a response. The silence stretched on until Dr. Peterson gently cleared her throat. Robert, it sounds like you're processing some difficult information. What's going through your mind right now? Dad ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from childhood, something he did when he was genuinely confused, rather than just stubborn. I don't understand how I got this so wrong. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to vulnerability I'd ever witnessed from him. You didn't get it wrong, I said carefully. You just got it incomplete. Marcus is strong, he is brave and capable, and all the things you've always said he is. But he's also human, and humans need support systems. But he never said anything. In all his emails, all his calls, he always sounded fine. Quote, Mom reached over and touched Dad's arm. Just like Sarah always said she was fine when you asked. Just like you always say you're fine when anyone asks how you're handling stress. The parallel hung in the air like a revelation. Dad looked at Mom with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise mixed with something that might have been recognition. That's different, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Dr. Peterson asked. Robert, when was the last time you shared a personal struggle with someone? Dad opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I watched him search his memory, perhaps realizing for the first time that he'd spent decades demanding emotional transparency from others while offering none himself. I handle my own problems, he said finally. How? I asked, genuinely curious. What does that look like for you? I work. I fix things around the house. I will stay busy. And when that doesn't work, when the problem is too big to fix with activity? Dad stared at the carpet. I guess I just push through until it gets better. What if it doesn't get better? What if pushing through just makes you more isolated and angry? The question seemed to physically pain him. I realized I was watching my father confront 30 years of emotional avoidance in real time. Robert, Dr. Peterson said gently, you mentioned earlier that you're proud of Marcus for his military service. What specifically makes you proud? His courage, his leadership, his dedication to protecting others. And where do you think those qualities come from? Training, discipline, mental toughness. What about emotional intelligence? The ability to stay calm under pressure, to make good decisions when others are panicking, to earn the trust and respect of his team? Dad looked uncomfortable. Those are leadership skills. They're also emotional skills. The same skills Sarah has been developing through her work in healthcare and her willingness to engage in therapy. I could see the connections forming in Dad's mind even as he resisted them. He was beginning to understand that the qualities he admired in Marcus weren't separate from emotional intelligence. They were expressions of it. I still think there's a difference between handling emergencies at work and handling combat situations, he said. You're right, I agreed. There is a difference. But the underlying skills are the same. Staying calm under pressure, making critical decisions quickly, working effectively with a team, managing your own stress so it doesn't compromise your judgment, taking care of your mental health so you can take care of others. When you put it like that, Dad trailed off. Mom spoke up again. Robert, remember when your father died? You took 3 days off work, arranged the funeral, settled his affairs, and then went back to your normal routine, like nothing had happened. That's what needed to be done. But you never talked about how you felt, you never processed the grief, you just buried it and kept moving. There wasn't time for feelings. There were practical matters to handle. And 6 months later, you were snapping at everyone, working 16-hour days, and drinking 3 times your normal amount of coffee. You were falling apart, but you couldn't admit it because that would mean you weren't handling it. I watched my father's face as Mom laid out this pattern he'd never recognized. The connection between emotional suppression and increased stress, between refusing help and struggling alone. I managed, he said weakly. You survived, Mom corrected, but you didn't manage. You just transferred your pain into other behaviors that affected the whole family. Dr. Peterson nodded approvingly. Linda, you're describing a very common pattern. When we refuse to process difficult emotions, they don't disappear. They manifest in other ways. Irritability, withdrawal, physical symptoms, relationship problems. So you're saying I should have gone to therapy when my father died? Dad asked, his tone more curious than defensive now. I'm saying you should have acknowledged that losing a parent is traumatic, regardless of your age or your relationship with them. You should have given yourself permission to grieve instead of immediately jumping into problem-solving mode. But the funeral arrangements could have been handled while also processing your emotions. Practical action and emotional processing aren't mutually exclusive. Dad sat quietly for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more uncertain. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to feel things and still function. Dad, I said gently, that's exactly what I've been learning to do. That's what therapy teaches you. That's what Marcus learned when he called me after his mission. But doesn't it make you weak? Doesn't focusing on feelings make it harder to handle real problems? It makes me stronger. When I acknowledge what I'm feeling, I can make better decisions about how to respond. When I pretend I'm not affected by something traumatic, I make mistakes. I get overwhelmed. I will burn out. Like when you had to take medical leave? The fact that he'd made this connection felt significant. Exactly. I pushed through for months, pretending the stress wasn't affecting me. By the time I finally asked for help, I was barely functional. If I'd acknowledged the problem earlier and gotten support, I never would have needed time off. Dad absorbed this information slowly. And Marcus? Marcus was able to save his squad because he knew how to manage his stress at the moment, and because he was willing to get help afterward instead of pretending the trauma didn't affect him. His commanding officer was impressed with his leadership during the crisis and his maturity in seeking counseling afterward, I added. Both aspects of his response were seen as signs of strength. Dad shook his head slowly. I've been thinking about this all wrong. It wasn't a complete transformation. Decades of ingrained beliefs don't change in a single conversation. But it was a crack in the foundation, a willingness to consider that his definitions of strength and weakness might be incomplete. Robert, Dr. Peterson said, what would it mean for you if emotional awareness and seeking help were actually signs of strength rather than weakness? Dad thought about this for a long time. It would mean I've been making things harder for myself and for my family. How so? If I could have talked to someone when my father died, maybe I wouldn't have been so angry all the time. Maybe Linda wouldn't have had to deal with my mood swings alone. Maybe I could have been more supportive instead of just absent. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Robert, you don't have to carry everything by yourself. I thought I did. I thought that was my job as a husband and father, to solve problems, not to have them. But you do have problems, I said. Everyone does. The question is whether you handle them in isolation or whether you use the support systems available to you. Like this, Dad said, gesturing around the therapy office. Like what we're doing right now. Like what we're doing right now. Dad looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite an apology, but something approaching respect. Sarah, when Marcus called you after his mission, what did you say to him? I listened. I told him his feelings were normal and understandable. I reminded him of coping techniques we'd discussed before. And I encouraged him to get professional help. And that helped him? It helped him feel less alone. It helped him remember that trauma is a natural response to traumatic events, not a personal failure. And it helped him make the decision to talk to a counselor. Dad nodded slowly. I wouldn't have known how to do any of that. You could learn, Mom said quietly. It's not too late to learn. For the first time in our family's history, the possibility of real change felt tangible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. I think, Dad said carefully, I need to have a different conversation with Marcus when he calls next. What kind of conversation? Dr. Peterson asked. The kind where I actually ask him how he's doing, and listen to the answer, even if it's not what I want to hear. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not vindication, but something deeper. Hope, maybe, or recognition. The acknowledgement that my father was capable of growth, even after all these years. And Sarah, Dad continued, looking directly at me, I think I owe you an apology. The words I'd been waiting my entire life to hear, spoken in a fluorescent-lit therapy office on a Tuesday afternoon. The words hung in the air between us. I think I owe you an apology. I held my breath, afraid that if I moved or spoke, the moment would shatter, and Dad would retreat back into his familiar patterns of deflection and denial. I've spent years telling you that your sensitivity was a problem, he continued, his voice steady but quiet. I told you that crying was weakness, that needing help was failure, that emotional awareness was self-indulgence. And I was wrong. Mom reached for his hand, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't just wrong about you, Sarah. I was wrong about strength itself. I thought strength meant never bending, never breaking, never showing cracks. But watching Marcus's squad survive because he could stay flexible under pressure, hearing that he's getting better because he was willing to admit he needed help, it's making me realize that my definition of strength was actually a recipe for brittleness. Dr. Peterson leaned forward slightly. That's a profound insight, Robert. What's it like to recognize that? Terrifying, Dad admitted. If I've been wrong about this, what else have I been wrong about? How many other opportunities have I missed to actually support my family instead of just demanding that they be stronger? I found my voice finally. Dad, you weren't trying to hurt us. You were trying to prepare us for a difficult world. But I was preparing you for the wrong things. I was teaching you to armor yourselves against life instead of teaching you how to navigate it with resilience and grace. There's a difference between armor and resilience, Mom asked. Armor protects you by keeping everything out, I said, the metaphor clicking into place. Resilience protects you by helping you bend without breaking. Armor makes you rigid. Resilience makes you adaptable. Dad nodded slowly. Marcus survived that firefight because he was adaptable. Because he could assess the situation clearly, manage his own stress, and make decisions based on reality rather than bravado. And he's recovering from the trauma because he's willing to process it rather than bury it, I added. Which means the skills I've been dismissing as weakness are actually, what, advanced life skills? Dr. Peterson smiled. Emotional intelligence, stress management, interpersonal communication, self-awareness, adaptability. These are all considered essential leadership qualities in most professional contexts. Including the military, I said. Dad, Marcus isn't succeeding despite his emotional intelligence. He's succeeding because of it. And you're not struggling because you're weak. You're navigating complex challenges with sophisticated tools. The shift in perspective was almost dizzying. Years of family mythology being rewritten in real time. I need to call Marcus, Dad said suddenly. What will you say to him? Dr. Peterson asked. I don't know yet, but I need him to know that it's safe to tell me the truth about what his job is really like. I need him to know that I'm proud of his courage in getting help, not just his courage in combat. And what about Sarah? Mom prompted gently. Dad turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just respect, but genuine admiration. Sarah, I've watched you handle crisis after crisis at the hospital. I've seen you comfort families who are losing loved ones, make life or death decisions under pressure, work 16-hour shifts, and still have energy to help other people. I called it weakness because you came home emotionally drained, because you needed time to process what you'd experienced. Quote. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. But you weren't weak. You were absorbing other people's pain so they didn't have to carry it alone. You were staying emotionally open in situations that would make most people shut down completely. That's not weakness. That's heroism. I started crying then, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time in my life, my father saw me clearly. And when you took medical leave, you weren't giving up. You were recognizing that you'd reached your limit and taking steps to recover so you could go back to helping people. That's not failure. That's wisdom. Dad, I'm not done, he said firmly, but his tone was gentle. You've been trying to tell me for months that emotional intelligence is a strength, and I wouldn't listen. You've been modeling healthy coping mechanisms, and I dismissed them as self-indulgence. You've been showing our family what it looks like to be brave enough to be vulnerable, and I criticized you for it. He took a shaky breath. Marcus's squad is alive because of the skills you taught him, skills I told you were worthless. If that's not proof that I've been an idiot, I don't know what is. Dr. Peterson intervened gently. Robert, it sounds like you're being pretty hard on yourself right now. Maybe I should be. Or maybe you could extend yourself the same compassion you're learning to show your children, I suggested. You weren't being malicious, Dad. You were parenting the way you'd been parented, using the tools you thought were right. But those tools hurt you. And now you're learning better ones. That's what growth looks like. Dad looked around the therapy office with new eyes. Is this what you've been trying to get me to understand? That this whole process, talking about feelings, examining patterns, learning new ways to cope, is actually practical life skills training? Essentially, yes. And Marcus has been using these skills to excel in one of the most demanding careers in the world. Right. And you've been using them to save lives and support families through their worst moments. That's the idea. Dad was quiet for a long moment. I feel like I've been speaking a foreign language for 30 years, and I'm just now realizing that everyone else was speaking English. Mom laughed through her tears. Welcome to emotional literacy, honey. Population, the rest of us. So what now? Dad asked. How do I learn this language? How do I become the kind of father and husband who actually supports his family instead of just demanding that they be invincible? The same way Marcus learned combat skills, I said. Practice. Patience with yourself when you make mistakes. Willingness to ask for help when you're confused. Does that mean coming to therapy? If you want to. Or reading books about emotional intelligence. Or just starting to have different kinds of conversations with Marcus and me. What would those conversations look like? Questions like, how are you really doing? And what's been challenging for you lately? And how can I support you? Instead of just talking about accomplishments and logistics. Dad nodded thoughtfully. And when you tell me you're struggling with something, instead of trying to fix it or minimize it, I should listen, ask questions. Acknowledge that it sounds difficult. Offer support without trying to take over. That sounds simple. Simple but not easy, Dr. Peterson noted. Especially when you're used to being the problem solver. It requires trusting that other people can find their own solutions with your support, rather than your intervention. Like how you helped Marcus, Dad said to me. You didn't tell him what to do, you gave him tools and let him figure out how to use them. Exactly. Dad stood up suddenly and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. When he turned back, his expression was determined. I want to do better. I want to be the kind of father Marcus feels safe calling when he's scared. I want to be the kind of father who sees Sarah's compassion as the superpower it actually is. Dad, you don't have to transform overnight. No, but I can start today. I can start by telling you both that I'm proud of who you are, not just what you accomplish. I can start by admitting that I have a lot to learn about being human. He sat back down and looked directly at me. Sarah, I am so sorry for making you feel like you had to earn my approval by becoming someone you're not. I'm sorry for criticizing the very qualities that make you extraordinary. And I'm sorry it took almost losing Marcus to make me realize that strength comes in many forms. I crossed the small space between our chairs and hugged him. He hugged me back, and for the first time in my adult life, it felt like my father was seeing all of me. Not just the parts he approved of, but the whole complicated, sensitive, resilient human being I'd always been. I love you too, Dad, I whispered, and I'm proud of you for being willing to change. When we separated, he wiped his eyes unselfconsciously, another first. Now, he said, how do I call Marcus and tell him that I've been an emotionally stunted fool for his entire life? Mom laughed. Maybe start with, I've been doing some thinking. And ask him to tell you about the mission, I suggested. Really listen to what it was like for him. Ask him how he's doing now. And tell him you're proud of him for getting help, Dr. Peterson added. Dad nodded, taking mental notes. This is going to be a very different kind of conversation than we usually have. The best kind, I said. The kind where you actually get to know your son. For the first time in our family's history, we left therapy feeling closer rather than more divided. Change was possible, growth was happening, and my father finally understood that the daughter he'd called weak had been strong all along. 3 months after that breakthrough session, I was restocking supplies in the ICU when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dad called me yesterday. We talked for 2 hours. What did you do to him? I smiled, remembering the conversation I'd had with Dad the week after our therapy session. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of library books about emotional intelligence, taking notes like he was studying for an exam. How do I tell Marcus I'm proud of him for going to counseling, he'd asked. And how do I make sure he knows it's safe to tell me when things are hard? The transformation hadn't been immediate or perfect. Dad still struggled with his instinct to fix rather than listen, still caught himself dismissing emotions as impractical. But he was trying, genuinely and consistently, to learn a new way of relating to his family. The real test came 2 weeks after our therapy breakthrough, when Marcus called home during one of his scheduled communication windows. For the first time in years, Dad didn't immediately launch into questions about missions and accomplishments. Instead, he asked a simple question that changed everything. How are you really doing, son? According to Marcus, there was a long pause on the line. Then, for the first time since his initial deployment, Marcus told Dad the truth. About the nightmares that still woke him up some nights. About the weight of responsibility he felt for his squad. About the counseling sessions that were helping him process years of accumulated trauma. About his fears and doubts, and the very human cost of being a warrior. Dad listened. He didn't try to minimize Marcus's struggles or redirect the conversation to more comfortable topics. He didn't offer unsolicited advice or remind Marcus how strong he was supposed to be. He just listened, asked follow-up questions, and told Marcus he was proud of him for being honest. That conversation lasted 3 hours, the longest personal discussion Marcus and Dad had ever had. The ripple effects were profound. Marcus started calling home more frequently, sharing not just the highlights of his service, but the full spectrum of his experience. Dad began opening up about his own struggles, his grief over his father's death, his fears about aging, his regrets about years of emotional distance from his family. Mom told me later that she felt like she was watching her husband discover a part of himself he'd kept buried for decades. It's like he's learning that he can be strong and vulnerable at the same time, she said, that they're not opposites, they're partners. The changes weren't limited to Dad's relationship with Marcus. Our own dynamic shifted in ways I never could have anticipated. Instead of our usual surface-level check-ins, Dad started asking about my work with genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand the emotional challenges of nursing, the toll of caring for critically ill patients, the skills required to support families through crisis. One evening, he surprised me by showing up at the hospital during my dinner break. I brought coffee, he said, looking slightly uncertain. I was hoping you could tell me more about what you actually do here. We sat in the cafeteria while I explained the complexity of ICU nursing, the split-second decisions, the emotional labor of comforting families, the way we had to stay calm and focused while surrounded by life and death situations. Dad listened with the same intensity he used to reserve for Marcus's military stories. "When you told that family their father wasn't going to make it through surgery," he said finally, "how did you know what to say?" "You don't really know," I admitted. "You just stay present with them. You acknowledge their pain without trying to fix it. You let them feel what they're feeling without rushing them through it." That sounds incredibly difficult. It is, but it's also the most important part of the job. Medical intervention can only do so much. Sometimes the healing happens in the space between people, in the willingness to witness someone else's pain without turning away. Dad was quiet for a moment. That's what Marcus needed from me after his mission, wasn't it? Not solutions or tough love, just someone willing to witness his pain. Exactly. And that's what you've been trying to get from me for years. Not praise for being strong enough to handle everything alone, but acknowledgement that handling difficult things is actually difficult. I nodded, surprised by how clearly he understood concepts that had taken me years of therapy to articulate. "I'm beginning to realize," Dad continued, "that I spent so much energy trying to protect you and Marcus from weakness that I never taught you how to be strong. Real strength, I mean, the kind that bends without breaking." "You were doing your best with the tools you had," I said gently. "Your parents probably taught you that emotions were dangerous, that vulnerability was liability. They did. My father never showed a moment of uncertainty, never admitted fear or sadness or doubt. I thought that was strength. I thought that was what good men did, shield their families from their own humanity. But that's not protection, Dad. That's isolation. When you hide your struggles, you teach your children that struggle is shameful. When you pretend emotions don't affect you, you teach them that emotions are weakness." Dad stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "And when you model emotional awareness and healthy coping, you teach them that they can be human and strong at the same time." Right. So Marcus didn't survive that firefight in spite of the emotional skills you taught him. He survived because of them. And he's thriving now because he knows how to process trauma instead of carrying it alone. Dad leaned back in his chair, an expression of wonder crossing his face. "You know what's funny? I spent years worrying that therapy would make you both soft, that emotional awareness would make you vulnerable to a harsh world. But it turns out I had it backwards. Emotional intelligence is armor, real armor, the kind that protects you from the inside out." Over the following weeks, I watched my father experiment with this new understanding. He started sharing his own struggles with Mom. Instead of handling everything in isolation, he called his brother, something he hadn't done in 2 years, and had an honest conversation about their father's death and its aftermath. He even scheduled his own appointment with Dr. Peterson. "I figure if it's good enough for Green Berets and ICU nurses," he told me, "it's good enough for retired accountants." His first solo therapy session was awkward, according to Dr. Peterson, who shared this with his permission during one of our family sessions. Dad came in with a list of topics he wanted to, quote, address efficiently, and seemed surprised when Dr. Peterson asked how he felt about each item. "I don't know how I feel about it," he said repeatedly. "I know what I think about it, but feelings are harder to identify." Dr. Peterson gave him homework. Pay attention to physical sensations throughout the day and try to connect them to emotional states. Tension in his shoulders might indicate stress. Warmth in his chest might be contentment. Tightness in his stomach could signal anxiety. Dad approached this assignment with the same methodical dedication he'd once applied to tax preparation. He started keeping a journal, just a few lines each day, noting physical sensations and possible emotional correlates. Within a month, he was identifying feeling states he'd been unaware of for decades. "I've been anxious about Marcus's safety for years," he told me one day with genuine surprise. "I just didn't recognize the feeling as anxiety. I thought it was a normal parental concern, but it was keeping me awake at night, making me irritable during the day. Once I named it as anxiety, I could actually do something about it." "What did you do?" "I called him more often, but differently. Instead of checking on his safety indirectly through questions about his work, I told him directly that I worry about him because I love him." It was terrifying to admit, but once I said it out loud, the anxiety became manageable. The changes in our family dynamics were subtle but profound. Conversations that used to end in frustration now led to understanding. Problems that used to create distance now brought us closer together. We were learning to navigate conflict with curiosity instead of defensiveness, to approach emotional challenges as puzzles to solve together, rather than evidence of individual weakness. Marcus noticed the difference during his next leave. "Dad's like a different person," he told me privately. He asked about my therapy. He shared a story about struggling with depression after Grandpa died. He told me he was proud of me for getting help. I don't think he's ever said anything like that before. How did it feel? Like I finally got my father back, like all these years he was hidden behind this wall of what he thought strength looked like. Now I can actually see him. The most significant change happened 6 months after our breakthrough therapy session. Marcus was preparing for another deployment, and instead of the usual stoic farewell ritual our family had always performed, Dad suggested we have a going-away dinner, where everyone could share their honest feelings about the separation. "I'm scared every time you deploy," Dad told Marcus over dessert. "I'm proud of your service, but I'm terrified something will happen to you. I want you to know that you can call me anytime, not just when you're fine, but especially when you're not fine." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, I've wanted to hear that for years." "I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to say it." "And Sarah," Marcus turned to me, "I need you to know that you're the reason I'm still alive. Not just because of that one mission, but because you taught me that seeking help is brave, not weak. You showed me that I could be a warrior and a human being at the same time." "You figured that out yourself," I said. "I just reminded you of what you already knew." "Maybe, but you saved my life anyway." Dad reached across the table and took both our hands. "I want to say something to both of you. For years, I tried to make you into the people I thought you should be, instead of seeing the people you actually were. I missed so much. Sarah's incredible strength, Marcus's emotional courage, both of your capacity for wisdom that I didn't even recognize as wisdom." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You're both better people than I taught you to be. You're stronger, kinder, more resilient than my parenting prepared you for. You became who you are, not because of my approach to strength, but despite it. And I'm more proud of who you've become than I've ever been of anything in my life." It wasn't a perfect ending. Real families don't get those. Dad still sometimes defaulted to his old patterns, still struggled with emotional vocabulary, still occasionally tried to fix problems that needed to be felt rather than solved. But he caught himself now, apologized when he missed the mark, and kept working to become the father he wished he'd been all along. Marcus deployed 2 weeks later, but his communication home was different. He called when he was struggling, shared victories and defeats with equal honesty, and trusted that his family could handle the full truth of his experience. Dad worried, but he worried openly, and somehow that made the worry bearable. As for me, I returned to work with a new understanding of my own strength. The sensitivity Dad had once criticized became my greatest professional asset. The emotional intelligence he'd dismissed as weakness became the foundation of my ability to help families navigate their darkest moments. The therapy skills he'd mocked became tools that saved lives, both literally and figuratively. Looking back, I realized that the moment everything changed wasn't when Marcus called from overseas, or when Dad finally apologized in therapy. It was earlier, when I decided to stop defending my worth and start demonstrating it. When I chose to be proud of my emotional intelligence instead of ashamed of it. When I recognized that seeking help wasn't evidence of weakness, it was evidence of wisdom. Dad called me weak at therapy, and for a moment, I believed him. But then my Green Beret brother reminded me that strength comes in many forms. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay soft in a world that demands hardness. Sometimes courage looks like vulnerability, and sometimes saving lives looks like teaching someone how to breathe through a panic attack. I'm not weak. I never was. I'm exactly as strong as I need to be, in exactly the way the world needs me to be strong, and finally, my father sees that too. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.